One day, Chris was walking around the streets looking for customers like he always did. Suddenly, a red sports car stopped right in front of him. When he saw the owner, Chris walked over and asked what he did for a living. The man told him that he was a stockbroker. That answer immediately caught Chris's attention. He looked at the luxury car in front of him, then looked at the tall office buildings of the stock market district in the distance. The people inside were dressed professionally. Their lives seemed full of opportunities and hope. For the first time, Chris clearly saw what the future he wanted could look like. That night, Chris told Linda that he wanted to become a stockbroker. He hoped his wife would support his decision, but Linda didn't believe it was the right choice. To her, this was just another unrealistic dream from Chris. She wanted him to solve their current problems first, instead of chasing a goal that seemed impossible. Their argument became more intense. Linda wanted him to sell the scanners he still had, and end this business that was going nowhere. But Chris refused to give up on his idea. He believed this was his chance to change their family's future. Even without Linda's support, Chris decided to give it a try, because becoming a stockbroker was the only hope he could see. So, Chris went to a brokerage firm to apply for an internship. To make a good first impression, he temporarily left his scanner with a street performer for safekeeping. Then he walked into the building. He got an application form from the hiring manager, Twistle, but when he was about to fill it out, he noticed that the street performer had taken his scanner and run into the subway station. Chris immediately chased after him, but he was too late. The subway doors closed, and his scanner was taken away. Losing one machine meant losing a major source of income. Chris could only return home disappointed. After that, he carefully studied the internship requirements. The competition for this opportunity was extremely tough. The company would select 20 interns. They would go through 6 months of unpaid training, and in the end, only one person would be offered a permanent position. It seemed almost impossible, but for Chris, this was his only chance. The next day, he brought his application back to the brokerage firm. Twistle accepted the form, and told him to wait for further notice. A month passed, but there was still no interview invitation. Chris decided he couldn't just wait anymore. He started waiting outside the company every day. Finally, he saw Twistle walking out of the building, but the manager didn't remember him, and was about to leave in a taxi. Chris seized the opportunity, and jumped into the taxi with him. He wanted to use this short ride to prove himself. Inside the taxi, Chris kept showing his abilities. He said he was good with numbers, and had a strong ability to learn, but the manager didn't seem very interested. Then Chris noticed the Rubik's Cube in the manager's hand. He said he could solve it. The manager handed the cube to him. Chris picked it up, and started working on it quickly. In the end, before the taxi reached its destination, he successfully solved the cube. That performance made the manager see him differently, and he remembered this young man. However, just when Chris thought his chance had finally arrived, the manager got out of the taxi and left. But he also left the taxi fare behind. $18. For the manager, it might have been nothing, but for Chris, it was money he desperately needed for life. He couldn't afford to pay it, so he had no choice but to escape from the driver. The driver chased him the entire way. Chris ran into the subway station. Just as the subway doors were about to close, he rushed inside, but his scanner wasn't as lucky. The machine got stuck in the closing doors, and an important part was damaged and lost in the accident. For the next 6 months, Chris could only rely on the remaining scanners to make money. He took his son Christopher, and moved into a cheap motel. To spend more time with his son, he took him to play basketball. His son told him that he wanted to become a professional basketball player someday. After hearing that, Chris instinctively rejected the idea. He told his son that he might not have that kind of talent. After hearing those words, his son quietly put the basketball down. At that moment, Chris realized he had said the wrong thing. He didn't want his son to give up on his dream, because of something he said. So he told him, "Don't let anyone decide what you can or cannot do. If you have a dream, you have to protect it and fight for it." Those words were also a reminder Chris gave to himself. From that day on, Chris began an even harder journey. During the internship, he used every second of his time to avoid being eliminated. While others were taking breaks, he stayed at his desk working to make more calls. He even cut down on his rest time. He didn't dare waste a single minute, because he knew he couldn't afford to fail. During the day, he worked and learned at the brokerage firm. At night, he took care of his son. At the same time, he continued trying to sell the remaining scanners. To improve his efficiency, Chris changed his sales strategy. He stopped contacting random names on a list. Instead, he focused on finding the people who actually had decision-making power. This new approach finally brought him an important opportunity. He successfully reached a major client, and got a chance to meet with him. But at this critical moment, the company assigned him to help with parking cars. As an intern, he had no choice but to accept it. However, parking in downtown was extremely difficult. By the time he finally parked the car, and arrived at the client's office, the client had already left. A chance that could have changed his life was lost just like that. But Chris refused to give up. He remembered the client had mentioned that he would take his son to a football game on the weekend. So he brought his own son, and went directly to the client's home. When Chris arrived at the client's door, he sincerely apologized for missing the appointment. At the same time, he managed to earn another chance to talk. The client didn't immediately become his customer, but this experience helped Chris meet more important people, and build valuable connections for the future. By the 4th month of the internship, Chris had finally sold several scanners. His life was beginning to improve, but a new setback came quickly. Because he had owed taxes for a long time, the tax department directly took all the money from his bank account. That money was what he earned from selling the machines to survive. Overnight, Chris lost everything again. When he returned to the motel with his son, he found their belongings placed outside the door. The room was no longer available to them. They were forced onto the streets. Chris took his son to the subway station. The child still didn't understand what had happened. To keep his son from being afraid, Chris told him the scanner was actually a time machine. He said that once they activated it, they could travel to another world. The father and son pretended they had entered the age of dinosaurs. To escape from the dinosaurs, they needed to find a safe cave, but the so-called cave was actually a public restroom inside the subway station. Chris took his son inside, locked the door, and placed tissues on the cold floor. He let his son sleep in his arms. Sounds kept coming from outside. To avoid waking his child, Chris held him tightly, and tried his best to protect that door. Inside that tiny space, the man who had always stayed strong, finally couldn't hold back his tears. The next day, life had to go on. Chris took his son, and started living on the streets. During the day, he continued working as an intern at the brokerage firm. At night, he took his son to a church shelter, and waited in line for a place to sleep. Because the beds were limited, if they arrived too late, they would have to spend the night outside. Every day, Chris lived between two completely different worlds. During the day, he wore a clean shirt, sat in a bright office, and talked with people in the financial industry. He looked like a young man who was moving closer to success. But at night, he became someone fighting for a place to sleep at a homeless shelter. The shelter turned off the lights at a fixed time every night. To prepare for the stockbroker exam, Chris could only use his limited free time to study. Sometimes, because he finished work too late, they couldn't make it to the shelter. The father and son had to spend the night on a bus, or find a place where they could escape the cold wind. To survive, Chris tried every possible way. He even donated blood to earn money for replacement parts. He used that money to repair his final scanner. One night, he finally fixed the machine. When the device powered on again, the small light from the scanner brightened the dark hallway. It was a sign that he had never truly given up. Later, Chris finally sold his last scanner. He received $250. He took his son, and checked into a regular hotel. For the first time in a long while, the father and son had a peaceful night. The 6-month internship came to an end. Chris passed the qualification exam, and achieved excellent results. On the final day of the internship, he worked in the office as usual. Suddenly, the hiring manager Twistle asked him to come into the conference room. Chris sat there, waiting for the final decision, because he knew this moment would determine the future of him and his son. The manager told him the company wanted to hire him permanently. They offered him a position as a stockbroker. At that moment, Chris had finally made it. The overwhelming happiness brought tears to his eyes. He walked out of the office, and into the crowd on the street. People around him were still rushing through their daily lives, but this time, he was no longer just watching from the outside. He had finally become one of them. This movie tells us that while chasing our dreams, we also need to see the person beside us, who is sharing the pressure with us. One person's dream should never become another person's burden. The struggles of adulthood usually don't happen overnight. They come from the pressure of life, building up little by little. Rent, work, family responsibilities, all of these things slowly drain a person's strength every single day. Chris's journey is a reflection of countless ordinary people. The scanners he couldn't sell represented the obstacles he couldn't overcome. The opportunities he missed again and again represented the regrets everyone experiences in life. I hope that one day, everyone can stop for a moment and give a round of applause to the person who never stopped fighting inside themselves.